After making our trip around the world that was baby quilt size, many of you have requested a bigger one. You want to see a tutorial for how to do a trip around the world in queen size, the simple, wonderful, easy way that I teach you. How did I choose the colors? I asked two people, a boy and a girl, what their favorite color was, and whatever they said, I was going to make this quilt. That would be a really fun idea to do with a bride and a groom. I'm laying the colors out and turning them around to see if I like how I'm laying them and if I like how they flow into each other. Later, I do change one of the positions of one of the fabrics. You watch and see if you can tell which, but I really do like how they flow together. Now it's time to cut them out. And this is going to go fast and quick. For this pattern to make a queen size, you need 9 different fabrics. I like my fabrics to have friends, so you notice that the pinks had friends and I have neutrals of black and white. Then you cut 3.5-inch strips from each of the 9 fabrics. You cut 14 strips. I only use 13, but depending on yardage, I want to make sure you have enough. You'll need to have 49 inches of usable fabric. If it were me, I'd buy 1.5 yards if you don't already own the fabric. I'm playing with them. I'm moving them around. I'm deciding the order. I'm looking if I like how it goes again. Once I have the strips cut, I always re-audition this and I trade things up and I decide, do I like where I have them laying? What do I want as my center? And I do put it just like this because I want my center to be the steel gray. That was the color that the boy chose, and I want to make sure I don't have a plus sign, so it's just going to look really nice. This is how I sew the strip sets. You can see I just start sewing them together and I make one complete unit so that I can lay it and double check and make sure I always have my colors correct. Here, the important part is whatever size seam you're sewing, be consistent with yourself. Again, you're making squares, so as long as your seam is consistent to you, it's not going to matter. I tried for 1/4 inch and there's no perfection in it, but if you're close and you're correct with yourself, it'll go well. I had 14 of those strip set units, and here we are. I pressed each seam as I went, so these lay really flat and really straight, and that is really important for this part. So you can see all my seams are pressed. I'm holding it up and I'm trying to straighten it, and you can see the fabric going, It's just back and forth, and you take it until it's happy and it's laying flat and straight, and then you line it up as evenly as you can. You can see me trying to make sure it's straight. Right here, every seam is also staggered. So I have the fabric up and staggered away from the seam because I'm going to cut through these, and I don't want to cut through a bunch of bulky seams one on top of each other. So I'm doing this tricky. If you're new at this, only cut one at once. But for those of you with more cutting experience, I am lining up the skinniest side. Did you see me point at it? So that I know where to cut. I am getting these so they're as square and straight as possible, and I'm going to cut 2 at once because I like to save time. But again, if you're new at cutting, only do 1 at once. I'm doing 3.5-inch strip cuts this other way, which makes it look like I've sewn all these little squares together and I took millions of years and I'm so brilliant. And honestly, this is such a fast process to strip piece this beautiful quilt together. This end one didn't quite make it. I still always cut it if I can so that I have leftover squares that are 3.5-inch squares. But I'm laying them out. This is what I always do. I count them and I try to figure out how many I have to cut. We need 144 of these segment strips for this pattern. That center piece, you rip off one and you only leave one, and then you put them opposite away from each other to make the trip pattern. So you decide which way you want the trip pattern to go. You have that center strip ripped off, so there's only one, and then you go opposite directions from each side. Making this guide strip is key to this whole pattern. So you pin together where it's not sewn together so that you can sew it correctly. Ready, it's all sewn together, it's all fitting, and now we get to go on to the next part. And I'm taking 8 out because I know for sure I will need 8 to do something I'll show you later. Otherwise, the rest of them I'm going to sew into loops. So it's not 1, it's 2. So I take 2 strips, and you cannot mess this up. You sew opposite ends together, you sew one end, and then I sew them both at the same time, just like I'm showing you. So I sew one end and then I grab the other end and I sew the other end. And yes, make sure it's not twisted, although if it were, it's not going to matter in the end, but it kind of matters to your brain. So sew it, make sure it goes straight across the thing like this, and take that other end and sew it together. And that is it. And you just do that with all the rest of the strips left. You'll know if you ever sew the same fabric to the same fabric that you have goofed. So other than that, this is beginner friendly, and remember to keep your seams consistent to yourself. However you sewed them when you originally sewed the strips together, sew your seams now that exact same size. As I finish all the loops, I grab them up, put them on the ironing board, and grab those 8 pieces that I set aside. And all I'm doing now is sewing them so that I'm only doing one seam. Because as we assemble our quilt, we're going to be ripping seams, and it seemed silly to sew them and rip them. And I know that I will need at least 4 sets, so that's why I have those. Now I just get my loops ready to go and lay out the quilt. And I cut the loops apart, put them all happily straight on my ironing board. This is not rocket science, but it's somehow really, really therapeutic fun. Time to lay out the quilt. These first 4 that I lay out are the ones I don't have to tear apart because I only ever sewed one of the seams together. There really isn't a correct way to lay the quilt out. You can do it however it makes sense to you. We're starting in the center so that you can see, and I want you to watch me with this seam. There it is. I'm going to take it apart with my scissors like the good girl that I'm trying to pretend to be, and there I lay it out. I'm a ripper, and I can't guarantee that all fabric wouldn't rip, but I can guarantee that it's worth the risk to me, so proceed with caution. You'll have to decide if you want to. You lay out the quilt, you can see that you look which one you're lining it up against, and you have that be what you rip off. And so that the next one is going to flow down. And this is how you make the trip pattern. If you don't have a big enough space or a big enough floor, I have a big enough floor to lay the whole thing out. But if you don't, I'm just going to teach this by laying out half at a time. You can assemble a queen size quilt like this half at a time because both halves are going to be exactly the same. You can rip it in the wrong place. I make it look like it's so easy because I've done it so many times. So pay attention, double check yourself before you rip, and you won't be sad. So here I am laying it out and getting it ready. And then I will show you how when I'm doing a queen size version, I pick it up and sew it together. And this is where I check and make sure everything is in its right place. The colors are so beautiful and they're tripping so well. I've started at one end and I very carefully pick up the strips. I keep them in order. I add the new one to the bottom. I take them to my sewing machine. As I sew these together, watch my fingers. I always budge it in, some people call it nesting, and I hold it with my finger until it sews over, and that will make your corners look really nice. Then I stay press it and press it open. When I press and do this, I do it every single time I have a long seam put together because it lays straighter. Notice the guide strip is at the top so that I can check and make sure my pattern is correct. Here, I can also check on the ironing board without the guide strip. And the more you sew these, the more you'll be able to just know that you have the pattern correct, but be sure to double check yourself because you do not want to end up seam ripping. I sew mine in like a third of it, and then I start the next and do a third of it in a section just because I don't like the bulk of holding the whole half of the quilt. After I get that done, I put it together and get the half together perfectly. I wouldn't normally lay this back down, but I did it so that we could admire our beautiful half of the quilt. And now we do like a shampoo bottle. We rinse and repeat. Here's the second half. I just finished laying it out. I pick it up, I go and sew it, and then I press it. And pretty soon that half is done too. As I slide the second half in place, you can see how gorgeous it is. And all we have left to do is to sew these 2 seams, and it will be done. I'm measuring it for you just for fun. My seams were a titch under a 1/4 inch, and so I ended up with my quilt being an inch bigger than the pattern says it should be. Even if you don't make the quilt, or you do, it would be fun to ask 2 different friends what their favorite color is, and then go pull fabrics and put a quilt together just to see. It's so fun and beautiful to do a trip around the world. I hope that you have an opportunity to make a queen size trip around the world. Stay merry and creative.